Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the newest episode, new edition, all on Zoom. And also, this is probably the first time we've been on Zoom, but welcome to the newest episode of the New World. Here goes the New World Order, where we interview people with various different backgrounds of talk about how this new world we're going to be endeavoring for ourselves between all the generations, because things are changing at a rapid pace every single moment of the day. And we have from the Force, a Force for Good, Alister McConachie. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me on, Aidan. I'm very pleased to be here and I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, and I've been looking forward to having this conversation for a while because you guys have been quite, as an organization, quite been putting up to the nationalist government that's in Scotland just now to promote the voice of the union. Can I just ask about yourself and what is the Force for Good that you do?
Sure. Well, A Force for Good is what we like to call Scotland's premier pro-UK campaigning organisation and think tank. And we were established back in March 2012, just shortly after David Cameron announced on the Andrew Marr show that he was going to hold a referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom should continue to exist or not. And I put it in those dramatic terms because that is essentially what it was about. Yet that the depth of that event was not perhaps fully realized. And I think he announced it back in the January of that year. And 2 months later, nothing had happened. And they had already scheduled when it was going to be. So myself and one or two others thought we've got to actually do something here because literally even the political parties who called it are not doing anything about this. So we founded A Force for Good, and I like to think that we've been going from strength to strength ever since. And we're a regular presence on the streets of Scotland. We were out, for example, with our regular street stall on Saturday. We're going to be out another 2 times in the coming 7 days. And that's physical activity on the streets of Scotland. We're unabashed unionists in that we are flying the Union Jack out there. We're flying all the flags of the British home nations. But we're really, as we like to say, keeping the British end up here in Scotland. And we're the only non-party political organization that's doing that. If we put aside some of the religious orders and groups like that, apart from the Orange Order, of course, we're the only non-party political group that really goes out there and does that. And we've been responsible, I think, for rejuvenating the idea of Britishness and the flag on the streets on a regular basis here in Scotland. And we have to do it. You know, we have this motto, we are the people who show up. And so if there's something that we need to show up to, then we'll do that. But it's not just physical activism that we're doing. We're also doing a lot of social media work. We've got platforms across all the main social media channels. And we're posting videos daily. We do a weekly show called Good Evening Britain every Wednesday night from 7 until 8 p.m., where we interview people who are going to be relevant to our audience. And then in the course of the next week, we cut parts of that and we put it across our TikTok, our YouTube, our Facebook, and our Instagram. And so we're a regular presence, as it were, on in Scottish politics, the
Mm,
media the media are forced to recognize us,
mm,
and they're forced to deal with us because we always show up, and so they have to cover us in some way, and that's a good place to be, I think,
mm,
for our organization. This is my full-time job. I've
mm,
been involved in this full-time since 2012. Before 2012, I published two magazines, two monthly newsletters. One was
mm,
called Sovereignty, and that was about self-determination,
mm,
um, and campaigned essentially to leave the European Union. And the other was called Prosperity, Freedom from Debt Slavery, which was about freedom from the international banking system
mm,
and its debt-based money system. That came to an end. I published that for 10 years, and that's no longer published. But I was just thinking a lot of that actually needs to be renewed
mm,
for the new era that we're in. So I might be talking a lot more about that in the coming years to
mm,
come. But yeah, we keep ourselves very busy,
mm,
and we fill a political niche that needs to be filled,
mm,
and we're pretty fearless when it comes to dealing with things. We're in a social situation where we're able to do that.
mm,
Not everybody is able to get out on the streets and be seen and be
mm,
photographed and
mm,
make a noise and so on, because
mm,
most people are normal in that sense. They have
mm,
jobs, they have responsibilities, and they don't necessarily want to put themselves forward. But
mm,
we, as in myself and the people who support a force for good on the
mm,
streets, we're in slightly different social circumstances where we're very able and
mm,
pleased and proud
mm.
to do that kind of work.
And you said you had to fill this kind of niche. What was the is the niche for the idea of supporting the UK, or I would say what is the dilemma that you see in the UK now leading, although this video is meant to be dedicated towards the election, which is a few days away, or by the time this video is published, is to probably be after or whenever it comes out. Where do you find the question of unionism and the UK, Scotland? Where do you find Scotland puts itself in now? Because I would say the nationalist government, the SNP, have placed themselves into a very divisive role to make sure Scotland is the weakening partner of the UK. But this is the message they promote. I would like to ask where does this little niche come into what you do?
I think I think in the Western world at the moment and there has been for a long time, there's a war against distinct nations.
Mm,
And we see the United Kingdom, or Britain, which we use as a shorthand for the United Kingdom. And when we say that, we mean Britain as in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland,
mm,
and Wales.
mm,
Britain or the United Kingdom, and we use both terms dependent upon the rhetorical
mm,
effectiveness at the moment. But we see that as a nation.
mm,
Now, that does differ from the way that, for example, Scottish nationalists will see Britain. You'll hear Scottish nationalists say, oh, Britain doesn't exist. Britain's a made up term. It's actually, there's
mm,
only Scotland, England,
yeah.
Wales,
Mm,
and they might even say Northern Ireland. Uh, but they don't see what we see. We see Britain, and this we came up with this phrase to sum it up. We don't see Britain as primarily a union of nations.
mm,
We see Britain as a nation of unions, unions
mm,
which have been developing through time, from the 1801 union with Ireland to the
mm,
1707 union with Scotland to the union with to the Regal Union, which was a huge
mm,
union back in 1603,
mm,
to the Tudor Union of
mm,
England and Wales back in 1534. So we see it
mm,
as a stage, a developing stage, and that Britain itself is a nation and Britain should be protected. So we don't talk about, oh, should Scotland be independent from the UK?
Mm.
If Scotland broke away from the UK, there would be no UK left.
Hmm.
There would be no UK left. And what was left would be a rump, and it would very quickly disintegrate.
Yeah. And sorry.
And it,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry.
No, 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 go ahead.
So we see that as the frame that we have. So
Hmm.
once we've focused on Britain as the nation, the first priority is to keep it together and as a nation as such. So our role is to politically work to keep it together in that way, to do whatever we can intellectually and physically in order to literally keep the flag flying.
Mm.
Now, once we've established Britain as a nation, then politically there's other elements related to the sovereignty of that nation,
Hmm.
whether that is its food, whether it's its energy supplies, whether it's the people and the family itself of the
Mm.
nation, whether it's the borders, whether it's defense, whether it's
Mm.
its democratic system. All of these things come in together once you've established what the nation is.
Mm.
So while we promote the nation, we also deal with the other matters of sovereignty
Hmm.
that are related to that nation. And on our website, we've been developing our what we call our 10 principles, 10 basic principles of patriotic sovereignty, which
Mm.
include what I've just spoken to you there
Hmm.
about. And I would say that these principles are being traduced daily by all the political parties. For
Mm.
example, take the borders,
Hmm.
okay? The Tories, no matter what they may say, have opened the borders for the last
Hmm.
14 years, and particularly in the last 6 years. Labour is going to do well. We'll see what Labour does about it, but it's not boding well. The SNP and Plaid Cymru are falling over themselves to have even more people coming into the country.
Hmm.
So these parties are not national parties. They're not.
Mm.
They don't respect the sovereignty of the nation, whether that nation is identified as Britain or whether you simply identify that nation as Scotland. And
Hmm.
we've been saying before, and we say it regularly on our programme, that the SNP is actually an anti-Scottish national party
Mm.
because it does not even respect the borders of the nation itself. And
Mm.
so if we say to people, like, it's not even a national party because it's not
Mm.
respecting the borders. If it was a national party, the first thing it would do would be make sure the borders are secure, and
Mm.
also that the country was energy independent. I mean,
Mm.
that's a huge element of a nation's national
Mhm.
sovereignty. Well, Scotland could most certainly be energy independent as far as fossil fuels are concerned.
Mhm.
But what's the SNP's attitude towards fossil fuels? It wants to get rid of it. So
Mhm.
even then, it's calling itself a national party, but it wants to destroy the source of cheap fuel for
Mhm.
the people of Scotland. And
Mhm.
then that becomes a war against the people, because once you
Mhm.
destroy their source of cheap fuel, then you're pushing people into poverty
Mhm.
because they can't afford the inevitable price of the high fuel that either has to be imported or has to be generated from very,
Mhm.
very inefficient sources. And so, in all ways, these parties are almost like engaged in a war against the
Mhm.
people. And you know what? I'm going to surprise you today,
Okay.
but I was coming in
Mm.
from the, I was in town with
Yep.
lunch with a colleague,
Mhm.
and I was given a leaflet outside outside Central Station,
Okay.
and
Mhm.
I read it. And time to accept the challenge. Workers have nothing to gain from a change of party and government. The working class is the only force for progress. All it has to do is accept that challenge, and change is needed. Britain needs independence, peace, unity of nation, jobs, industry, food, energy, transport, houses, health, education,
Mm.
culture, and more. We don't need war, division between workers, mass immigration, or rundown of industry, agriculture, and public services, or destruction of the natural environment, or export of jobs and sale of businesses abroad, or a return to the EU. All electoral parties support war abroad and oppression of workers at home. All support mass immigration and the breakup of Britain. They talk progress and change, but their policies amount to more of the same. Parliament does not run the economy, financial markets do. Who's that leaflet from? The Communist Party of Britain, Marxist
I
Leninist.
was gonna say, I mean, did you just tell me Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto or something? I was like, oh man, you could just lead the Marxism from a mile off. My God.
Do you think so?
A little
Yeah.
bit. Just
Well,
the
I personally agree with 100% of that.
yeah.
But I'm not a Marxist. I am a nationalist, though. I am
No,
a
no.
British
It's
patriot.
some of the stuff that they teach is to sound some of it sounds great, but the idea is to make you go into that, and then once you fall into the trap, you're like, oh, but you wanted progress. Here we go. But that's all it was. But yeah.
Yes, there's always the danger of that, and no party is perfect. And I know that the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, are an unusual party in the
Hmm.
sense of
Yeah.
differing from the other communist parties, which are very much basically pro-globalist,
Hmm.
pro-open borders,
Yeah.
and really don't have the
Hmm.
ability to stand against the powers that they rail against. But
Hmm.
as far as these things are concerned, there is what that leaflet has done is identify that there is a war being waged. What they call the workers
Hmm.
against, I would just call the people of this country,
Yeah.
and
Which is true,
and
by the way.
and
That is very
yes,
true.
and that's so that was the most cutting leaflet that I've
Mm.
seen during this election
Mm.
cycle, and being a political Anorak in those sense. I keep
Mm.
all the leaflets,
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
get through the door,
Mm.
and they were all pretty adenine. Other than the one for reform, which I liked, which stood out because it was the only one which mentioned immigration reform, uh,
Right. Hmm.
that Britain needs reform,
Hmm.
and so that was the most.
Yeah.
Um, that's the one that had the best policy,
Hmm.
or rather had a policy, because
Right.
most of the others are just simply like, we will tackle poverty,
Mm.
and we will drop VAT. Well, maybe that would be a good idea, but it's a little
Mm.
bit obscure for most people.
Yeah.
Anything that involves percentages and numbers, I always say keep out of a political party leaflet, because who are you talking to? Not that many people understand.
Hmm.
Under, you see that with politicians, they go, the economy's risen 23% since we've been in power. What on earth does that even mean? 23, how do you measure that? I know what it
I
means because I
know.
kind of have a
Yeah.
mathematical sense, but you'd say
Mm.
something like, oh, we've doubled the power of this.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. But once you
Mm.
start using percentages and numerals and stuff like
Mm.
that, I mean, it's totally absurd that trained politicians would even do that. Anyway, that's just that's
We
just a
we
wee
see
bit.
that all the time anyway. Like when it comes to any number to anything. Although I kind of would agree with some of the stuff in the manifesto, but the only reason the communists say that is just to get you on board. And then when you've entered the utopia, they can just shoot you in the back, like they've done already countless times. But that's just me moaning at the communists. But because they know they can, I probably agree with a lot of what you said in that message there. It's just the fact that I've known these guys are just the leftist twisting of words, make an enemy of the class, and then when we become in charge, we will be better. We will be much better and not take any traits that they've done before,
Hmm.
stuff like that. And I
Yeah,
think we see that more and more when it comes to, especially, well, you mentioned 2010 to 2012 with David Cameron when I was probably a child. And just seeing the dynamics of how things have gone for Scotland mainly, because I think for you and me, we've seen so much change where the banks were smaller, they've gone huge. The governments are smaller, they've taken more power, more control, and there's more civil liberties getting taken away from people every single day. And there's just so much little things that keep happening, and it's so much to keep a track of, especially if you're not politically aligned. You don't follow anything that's going on because you got your life. You like you said, normal people. You got your own things, like normal people, not like us who have half alive, but half not alive because we enjoy doing this stuff. But I've no guilt in that whatsoever because I enjoy looking at this stuff all the time anyway. But now coming to basically a decade of after the independence stuff, after so many years of governments of SNP, Tories, Labour, we're looking at 28 years of a paradigm that I think most people are sick of, which is, the big globalist utopia world that we're kind of getting forced into. And it's actually putting against the ideas of Britain itself, where it's a self-governing sovereign country where it can't really do its own thing. And now it can't even run its own borders inside its own borders. And there's things are going long and long, nothing's working, people are getting fed up. And then we have an election coming up, 4th of July, because we want to take stuff from Americans too. It's fine. Um, but I want to say, when it comes to this general election, how do you think this is going to go? We'll go with England for just now. How do you think it's going to go for like in voting in general? Like, who are you voting for? How do you think this election will go?
It's going to be one of the most interesting elections. It was almost a few weeks ago, it was going to be one of the
Mm,
drabbest and most boring elections
mm,
that we've ever had. And then Nigel Farage made his grand entrance, and that
mm,
did transform the election completely. And basically, Nigel has been a force on British politics for many years. I knew him back in the 1990s when he and
mm,
I both sat on the National Executive Committee
mm,
of the UK Independence Party. And everybody could tell that he was a rising star.
mm,
And he went on to really make an impact on the British public consciousness to an extent that we might not even have seen fully yet. But he was the man that basically delivered Brexit because Brexit was going to be such a close vote.
mm,
And he knew that to get it over the line, he
mm,
had to emphasize immigration once again.
mm,
And he did that. And it was his entrance into the Brexit debate that got Britain Brexit because
mm,
enough people believed at the time, and it's certainly
mm,
possible, that it would by leaving the EU, we would lower immigration. And once we had left the EU, you see, people thought that the political class, and I do like to use that phrase because it does separate them from people like you and I, people
mm,
thought the political class would deliver on what the people had voted for. How
mm,
wrong we absolutely
mm,
were. Not only, and we're talking here about the Tories, not only did they not deliver, but they went the other way and they increased immigration massively
mm, mm,
and completely out of hand. And so Nigel makes his entrance again. And I think what we're going to see, and let's talk, as you say, about England, is a very, very big vote for reform in
mm,
England. Now, back after back at the 2015 election, UKIP, as it was then, got almost 4 million votes throughout the United Kingdom,
mm,
and they got one MP. And what we're going to see, I think, this year is Reform getting more than 4 million votes, maybe even getting 7 or 8 million, possibly getting more than the Lib Dems.
mm,
But unfortunately, because of the first past the post system, getting very few seats. Now it is all the all the polls are saying that Nigel will be elected
mm,
in Clacton and that Lee Anderson will be elected in his seat. But beyond those two seats, I personally, and
mm,
I'm not following the polls very carefully, but I struggle to
mm,
see how under the first past the post system
mm,
they will win any other seats. They might if there's a Labour and Tory marginal,
mm,
and somehow Reform is able to take sufficient votes, half of the Labour votes and half of the Conservative votes.
mm.
Reform might come through the middle with a very slim majority. That might
Hmm.
happen in some seats, but I think
Hmm.
what's more likely is you'll get a lot of strong second place finishes
Hmm.
for Reform, where they thrash the Tories in lots of seats, but simply don't get sufficient numbers to form first past the post. So
Hmm.
you're going to have millions of people who are going to feel effectively disenfranchised.
Hmm.
And that's not that's not good.
Hmm.
And so the question is, what will then happen as a consequence of that? Now, that's what I see happening in England.
Hmm.
Now, in
Because yeah.
Scotland,
Hmm. Sorry.
sorry,
No, no, it's
yeah,
fine.
in
Just
Scotland, because it's different up here because we've
hmm.
got a strong fourth party already in the
Hmm.
SNP, which is in fact the major party. But Reform are standing in all 57 seats
Hmm.
in Scotland. And what would be a good result for Reform would be saving some deposits. Now, what that means is to stand in a constituency, you need to put up £500 and you also need 10 signatures of registered voters in that constituency. Now, that £500 is called your deposit. If you
Hmm.
get 5% of the vote, then you save your deposit. And that's extremely difficult, actually, for small fringe parties, parties that get no coverage in the media,
Hmm.
parties that the media is against. Here
Hmm.
in Scotland, the media are very parochial and they really hold on to their little four-party system,
Hmm.
five parties if you include the Greens. And they certainly don't like groups like Reform.
Hmm.
And I'm speaking from experience. I know they didn't like groups like UKIP. UKIP never won any of our deposits when we stood at general elections in Scotland. Far from it. We would struggle to get 1% of the vote. So if Reform
Hmm.
managed to get like 5% of the vote in some constituencies, that would be really amazing. And what it would
Hmm.
say is that they are definitely on to get seats on the regional list at the Holyrood election in 2026. And that's that would also depend, of course, if they were if if things were heading that way, that would also depend upon how
Hmm.
well Reform does in England. And if in the next couple of years Reform manages to get up a bigger head of steam somehow in England
Hmm.
and gets more publicity and so on, then that will all benefit Reform in Scotland as well. But I think it might be possible that Reform could maybe win one or two deposits in Scotland. I'd certainly
Hmm.
like to see that. That would worry the establishment here in Scotland, and anything that worries them is good news as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, because I'm in the reform camp anyway, and I've been watching this whole dilemma going on for the last few weeks, and you're just seeing the establishment bodies, the media types. I'll go with England first, then I'll go to Scotland because, like you said, it's a different ball game. And I think that's a lot of things people don't realize. It's a different ball game for England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. There's different ball games, but maybe it's not so bad for Wales because everyone kind of is on the same team anyway, except unless you're a Labour voter, I guess. There's something with you and the miners. Doesn't matter. Um, yeah. What what I'm seeing with the form is an absolute strife when it comes to young people, like young voters who are starting to see the consequences of multicultural Britain not being so beneficial as what they were told in their pamphlets or what they were ever told before. And it's now the city centers are dying and the areas of childhood memories are just kind of a mess. And there's people, we know young people are very active, but what we were thinking in the forum, we were like, is there going to be enough young people who think, I care about this country more enough? Well, there seems to be a lot more than we were expecting because um most people are quiet. We all know that. You don't want to get noticed and spotted and, fingers pointing at you, you're racist or whatever. Most people now, especially people who are like, well, we don't like the main establishment parties because none of them really talk for us. And that's both sides. And there's a lot of people who are politically what's the word? Politically isolationist or neutral in the sense of they don't have a party to go to. And the forum just shows that unity movement for the young people. Sorry, my laptop's going off. Showing the unity for people to actually be there. And I think that's what the forum's showing. The forum's expected to win at least 10 seats. 10. That's their expectations. I can't remember which ones, but definitely Nigel's seat anyway. And they've definitely got the candidates out there, and we're definitely seeing the media not like it, especially the Westminster bunch, not wanting to get that's sending an actor out to pretend to be racist to Rishi Sunak or whatever it is. And there's so much though things you're starting to see now, and there's young people like, we're not as thick as you think we are. But it's a little surprise when it comes to Gen Z. When it comes to Scotland, I'm definitely seeing if it comes to the forum, they've definitely put their seats, they've got everyone in their seats. What they're aiming for is not to really win seats in Scottish election, but if they can take the seats away from the Tories or swap the votes about because people see the Conservatives in Scotland not as actually as conservative, something I noticed a long time ago. Bless you. Noticed they weren't really conservative a long time ago, and well, we're like, there's a lot of people are thinking, well, we could actually just vote the form because at least the people who are in the form are genuine people who aren't multi-millionaires or thousands of pounds going in. They're just regular folks. Because I've got the candidate in my area, Joe Hart, and she's only been in the campaign for 3 weeks. I shouldn't be saying that, but it's true. And she couldn't be any more normal if you tried. And then you get David Bull, that was he's the co-leader of the forum, or the co-manager, whatever it is. Nice guy. And you're just like, everyone who's concerned and is voting the forum is actually just you're just normal people. It's not this big far right conspiracy brown shirts that we see in the TV tell us it is. It's not even close. And I think the forum's just filling that gap in that, well, especially for the young people who are on the unionist side or the pro UK side, I think that's what they will go into. But the forum's aims are more see what they can do here and then dominate the 2026 election seats. That's what they're aiming for because they've been aiming. I had this meeting thing last week. That's what their aim is: the 2026 seats, take over all the Tory seats or take over whatever they can get away from whoever it is. But when it comes to the selection up here, I can see Labour gaining a lot of seats and the SNP losing a lot of seats.
Yes, yes, I'd like to think you're correct. Those predictions about 10 seats for reform, I'd like to think that was correct. Time will no doubt tell, and
Yeah.
we'll know on
Hmm.
Friday
Hmm.
morning. Yes, Labour are going to take quite a few seats up here. The SNP, though, may hang on in some seats. I know people who are usually voting. You see, there's SNP Labour marginals, as you know, and there's also SNP Tory
Hmm.
marginals.
Hmm.
And the Tories have 6 seats at the moment. I think they're mainly in those such marginals, and
Hmm.
they're aiming for another 6, which are presently occupied by the SNP. I
Hmm.
think the Tories will be lucky to win those because I think most of their, well, many, sorry, sufficient numbers of their supporters will simply defect to reform. And I
Hmm.
know personally people who are doing that
Yeah.
anyway. And it's like, who cares? They're like, well, whatever. At the
Hmm.
end of the day, an SNP MP can't do very much anyway
Hmm.
at Westminster. At least they can't run the country. They can't run the United Kingdom, but Labour will run the United Kingdom. And some
Yeah.
people are worried that Labour will run it into the ground, of course. So
Well,
does it really matter if you got an SNP MP? I don't think it matters that much.
mm,
What I'm concerned about is what Labour is going to do if they have
mm,
a massive, essentially dictatorial majority,
mm,
which would, which they will be free to do whatever they want with.
mm,
And that could, I mean, worst black pill out there, give everybody who lives here the right
Yeah.
to vote on the
Hmm.
basis of residence
Hmm.
rather than 5 years and citizenship. They could really mess it up. In fact, front cover of the Herald on Sunday yesterday, which I have here beside me, says
Mm.
Labour aims to work with SNP to encourage immigrants to live in Scotland.
Great.
Labour aims to work with SNP to encourage immigrants to live in Scotland. So, you vote Labour, you get SNP
Mm.
anyway. You vote SNP, SNP can't actually make that happen, but Labour can make that happen.
Yeah.
Labour can
Mm.
change the laws, and I
Mm.
worry. I worry that Labour are wanting to do to Britain and Scotland in particular
Mm.
what happened to the Republic of Ireland in the last couple of years, which
Mm.
just flooded with so much immigration, and knowing that the people have no political spokesmen to speak for them.
Mm.
Um, so it'll depend where the seats lie and
Mm.
who is there, but it could be very serious. A Labour
Mm.
government, but looks like that's what we're going to get anyway.
Mm.
And we'll just have to figure out what to do after we realize where the cards are actually lying. But I don't think there's. I think those are very serious concerns. And this, right? For example, in this article, it's Jackie Bailey is speaking. She's an MSP. I think she's the deputy leader of Labour in
Mm.
Scotland. The Herald on Sunday asked Ms. Bailey how Labour planned to keep the support of Yes supporters who had switched to remove the Tories to then in turn oust the SNP.
Mm.
And she replies, quote, and this worried me, quote, because while we might fundamentally disagree on one issue, which is the Constitution, we
Mm.
are absolutely in lockstep on a whole range of other issues which the Scottish Parliament is responsible for, close quote, absolutely in lockstep with the SNP. And she says that as if it's some kind of boast.
Mm.
So again, vote Labour, get SNP,
Yeah.
regardless, vote
Mm.
SNP, get Labour, probably. So the whole thing is ridiculous. And it does
Mm.
speak to the fact that we have no people other than these new incomers that call themselves reform. We've got
Mm.
nobody who's really addressing
Yeah.
these issues from a pro-British people, British worker, whatever you want to call them,
Mm.
standpoint. We've nobody. And so that's why people are looking at reform. And they will get, as I say, they will get a good vote, but whether it's enough to get any kind of significant power
Mm.
on Friday morning, time will tell.
Yeah, you're definitely correct when it comes to what we're going to see with the S&P coming forward. Labour and S&P, they're just going to be more or less the same. There's going to be absolutely no difference between the two. But I think most of those votes will come out of grievance against the SNP by their own people who've probably supported independence in the past and they're like they don't want to anymore. Or they're just like, I'm sick of you of whatever reason you have to not like the SNP or whatever reason it is. But I kind of want to ask, when it comes to the state of Scotland as in the Union, do you think that prospect of the independence thing will come back? Or do you think that idea is dead and gone? Or do you think Labour's going to do something with it afterwards? Or how do you think that's all going to play out?
Well, the idea of so-called independence for Scotland is never going to be dead or
Mm.
gone. It's something that's just a natural part of the Scottish political psyche,
Mm.
and it ebbs and flows at various times, often depending upon what is the state of the larger Britain that we are a part of. And so that's why, I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum. We exist very much as part of a British organic nation.
Mm.
And our job at A Force for Good is to talk up that organic nation and to advocate for what we understand as its best interests within a sovereign conception of
Mm.
the nation and promoting British national sovereignty basically as our political ideology. And when you do that, when you have people powerfully promoting British national sovereignty, then generally everything works together really quite well.
Mm.
What's happened in the past few years, of course, is that we've had leaderships which don't necessarily believe in those things. In the last few years, we've had leaders who have not been able to make a really good case for Britain, the
Mhm.
nation, and
Mhm.
maybe that's just a function of who they are and so on. And nobody's perfect, and we can't imagine that everybody can do that. But to keep Britain together, we do need leaders who want to keep it together, who
Mhm.
advocate for it to be together, and who create policies which will knit it together, which will
Mhm.
strengthen the ties that bind. And we
Mhm.
cannot be having policies which are intended to loosen the ties that bind and
Mhm.
then stand about and go, oh, the country's breaking up. How did that happen? Well, it
Mhm.
happened because of the policies that you enacted. And it's
Mhm.
how do we see Britain constitutionally? And
Mhm.
as unionists, what we see is that the devolved institutions of Holyrood and the Senate and Stormont and so on, they are British institutions. They're arms of the wider British political body.
Mhm.
And when you see it in that, again, I use the word organic sense, then devolution as such won't endanger the United Kingdom as
Mhm.
such, but it will endanger the United Kingdom if you set up devolution and you treat devolution in such a way that these are meant to be opposites to the center. It's
Mhm.
like when you build up Holyrood and you say it's essentially an equal and opposite government to the British central government, that's setting up a tension, a contradiction, because you cannot have two heads
Mhm.
on one body. And language is so important. Language is the essence of politics. So if you are calling, as all the British mainstream politicians do, and as all the devolved politicians do, if you're talking about the Scottish government, then you're making everybody think it is an equal and opposite government to the British Westminster government. And so most people are going to think, well, why isn't Scotland independent? It must be because this government is somehow
Yeah.
colonizing and oppressing this government here.
Mhm.
And so you're just throwing the whole thing into a tailspin that makes no sense. But if you treat Holyrood, um, if you understand the relationship is a hierarchical one, it is a vertical one. We do have the
Mhm.
British government as the most powerful. The British Parliament really is the most
Mhm.
powerful, and then the other devolved institutions come off that.
Mhm.
And the point of the central British Parliament is to look after the other areas of Britain, not to fight with it. Um, but the big danger, of course, with the devolved assemblies, which Labour never thought would happen, is that if your political opponents, if the separatist people get power in those parliaments, then they're going to use that against the centre. Labour never thought that would happen.
Mhm.
Labour thought they'll always be in charge in Scotland and they'll always have a Labour government in Britain. And in that sense, devolution does kind of work because there's no real inherent tension that's going to break us up. But when you have a separatist party in power, then that just kind of throws everything out of kilter. And we may be looking at the Separatist Party, which is to say the SNP, we may be looking at them losing out now. They may be on a downward trajectory, but that will only be for a few years because how because there's always another election comes up 4 or 5 years later, and you've always got to think ahead. You know, one of my personal heroes is the Duke of Wellington, who said the business of politics is knowing what is on the other side of the hill.
Mhm.
And so if I do this, what are going to be the consequences? Good
Mhm.
consequences and bad consequences that I will inevitably have to face when I go round the corner there. And
Mm,
our politicians don't think in those long-term ways. They only
mm,
think in short-term ways. And so, say Labour get into power on Thursday. Now, say they give new powers to Holyrood
mm-hmm,
between now and 2026, then those new powers is they're basically just giving new powers to their political opponents, which
mm-hmm.
is to say they're giving new powers to the SNP. If they give powers over visas, as Jackie Baillie seems to suggest might be possible, then these will be powers that the SNP will use in
Mm-hmm.
whatever way it can
Mm-hmm.
against the centre. So they'll have these visas and then they'll start talking about how they're this or that and how they're benefiting Scotland in some way, shape, or form. And it'll all just be a load of nonsense, of course, but most
Yeah.
people won't be able to understand the intricate economics of the matter. And most people in rural Scotland, unless they've been flooded with mass immigration, they won't
Mm-hmm.
even know what's happening in the cities either. So
Yeah,
basically,
because I see that a lot where although the immigration is more effective in England, you don't really see that much in Scotland. But even if you look at the census, we've got an extra, the Scottish population has actually grown 50,000 extra people, but that extra 50,000 people isn't people from this country, funny enough.
yes,
And
and
that's and that's no racism claim or anything. That's just census
well,
information.
the census is wrong because I'm
Mm,
personally acquainted with more than 50,000 immigrants in this particular
yeah.
area of
Mm.
Glasgow that I live in. So, I mean, that's complete baloney. It's way, way
Yeah.
above that.
Mm.
And you notice
Mm.
it now every day at the supermarket. Every day
Yeah.
you're seeing
Mm.
all wonders of mankind there.
Mm.
And so
It's not like we have a
it's
problem with
really
them. We just
going.
notice it. It's not like
Sure,
we have a
absolutely.
problem. We just see that. And you'd be the same if you were in Nigeria and you saw a bunch of Chinese or more Chinese than the Nigerians that were there. They'd say the
Yes.
same thing, and no
Well,
one would ever say anything different.
That's right. And I don't see 50,000 new houses suddenly cropping up either. So there's all these
Hmm.
infrastructure issues that
Hmm.
are related to that. And that's really these are huge
Hmm.
issues. Anyway, so that was just taking me a little distraction there. But
Yeah, yeah. It's
what's going
my
to
fault.
happen then is
Hmm.
no, not at all. It's my fault. I went off on a different tangent. What's
Hmm.
then going to happen is if they give all these new powers to the SNP, then that will rejuvenate the SNP because you're giving them new toys to play with, new
Hmm.
powers to play with, and they'll use these powers against Labour. And so when 2026 rolls around, the SNP might actually have recovered from their thrashing on Thursday
Hmm.
in the public mind, in the public mind. And then they might not do that badly in 2026. The SNP might even get back in again in 2026, or it might be a Labour coalition with
Hmm.
the Lib Dems or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, but that's 2026. There's 2031, which is only going to be 5 years down the line. So what happens then is in that intervening period, people fall out of love with Labour in Scotland.
Hmm.
And so when 2031 rolls around, and they've got that lady Kate Forbes has come into her own, and she's preaching the benefits of
Hmm.
separation. And people say, well, you know, I like that little young. She won't be so young then, but I like that lady. Speaks a lot of sense. Seems very sensible.
Hmm.
2031 comes
Hmm.
around, the SNP get a massive majority again,
Hmm.
and but now they've got all these new powers that
Hmm.
Labour gave them in the intervening period, and
Hmm.
so they might even have the power to call referendums themselves. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a power that they're calling for, and
Hmm.
when they get that, then
Hmm.
it's everything to play for. So
Hmm.
no, the SNP will never be defeated completely because it is a natural part of the Scottish
Hmm.
brain to have that thought. Um, but politically, it's as we say, it's not a clever thought, but it's
No.
always going to be there and it's always going to be exploitable.
It's always a potential threat to
Yes.
the idea of a union, where I would actually say there's a lot of problems with the general public who are not informed about things they're told, like what they're told. Because I made a video on TikTok not long ago where there's a HMRC building in Edinburgh. It's got the in the windows, the Union flag is on it.
Yes,
And
yes.
I made this stupid mockery joke saying, "Oh, basically the English hate us." That's what the aim of the joke was. And then by the end of it was like, "Oh wait, it's a HMR. Sorry, it's a UK government building with the Scottish flag painted on the side. That's what it was. Sorry." It's a government building with the Scottish flag into the windows. And basically what I was saying was in that video, which has got nearly 20,000 views on TikTok. Honestly, that app is something else, something we should all pay attention to. But um, what I was saying in that video was like maybe the English don't hate us and they are up here and they actually like being with us. And the manipulation of people that's been saying, we're a colony, we are oppressed, we have this, and people just falling along to that line. People who aren't like you and me or activists who pay attention to everything that's going on. When you got just normies, people who aren't into the system, who just want to do the 9 to 5 jobs, be their family, and then they believe it. Because in that video, there was so much people that got upset by that, by saying the English don't hate the Scottish. And I'm like, what? I was like, what kind of world did I get brought into here? Like this whole dilemma that we've built, like of hating each other. And I'm like, can you not move on beyond that? Because I swear to God, there's other countries that's done a lot worse. We just did it in a different time period. Like, I would always relate to the certain conflict in the Middle East to what we were doing 300 years before the active, like before now, like the 1500s, 1600s, where we would kill each other by the just mad, killing each other, going mad. But now we're moved on to the progressive stance of actually working together and being friends, having families, and having none of these issues. But all these things keep cropping up again with a stupid TikTok video. So do you think that people are still just, is it not informed enough, or they listen to much of the wrong information, or what do you think?
Hmm.
It's an opinion, I know. Sorry.
It's I think you might be exaggerating it. I
Yeah,
mean,
I would be,
in the
I know.
sense that
Yeah.
TikTok is a certain demographic that's
Hmm.
not necessarily reflective of everybody. But I do notice, yes, there is a lot of anti-English stuff on TikTok. It
Hmm.
comes mainly from a certain demographic,
Hmm.
uh, a certain sectarian demographic. Let me say no more than that.
Yeah.
Um, Mainly, and so that's all tied in with like various unhappinesses with
Hmm.
Irish history as well,
Hmm.
and that is a an element in Scotland.
Hmm.
But again, that's only a small element, and that's only it's only a vocal minority of a small group.
Hmm.
Um, but and so I would caution against paint. I know you weren't painting a broad brush, but it's not
No.
as perhaps as bad as you think. Although on TikTok, yes, just
Yeah.
because of the way that the videos
Hmm.
feed into the algorithm and so
Yeah.
on,
Hmm.
you do find that basically everybody who comments is anti, but that's
Hmm.
not reflective of the nature of reality. But um,
Yeah, sorry, I should
it,
reflect
it,
that.
it
That's not what I meant by TikTok. Just it was just on that platform that I saw it all on. And I do see this
yeah,
on all other social medias and in public too, where
yeah.
people tear down Union flag stickers and so on. But it's this version of realities in every other country as well. So it's not just here.
Well, there's lots of anti-British haters, and you can categorize them. That you've got some of your extreme types who are the Republican Irish, but not all of the Republican Irish,
Hmm.
but some of them they're very extreme anti-British. Then you get your people who support like the anti-monarchy stuff and will go out on Republic, and they're actually sort of middle class intellectuals
Hmm.
who make all sorts of, what they think are clever arguments
They're not
uh,
very clever.
against that. They're not very clever
No.
either. And and then you'll get people who are just like kind of wanting to tear down authority, and they'll
Hmm.
recognize Britain as kind of a cohesive nation that they just want to
Hmm.
destroy. So there's all different strands working in there, and then you get the Scottish nationalists, many of whom are still stuck in like the 14th century and wars
Hmm.
of independence back then, and who are still complaining about the terms of the Treaty of Union in 1707. That's still keeping them awake at night.
Yeah,
And so,
300 years later before they were born.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
there's all
Hmm.
sorts of strands. What's the
Hmm.
answer to it? Uh, just promoting your particular position through educating however you can, through
Hmm.
standing up, and through supporting people who are in a position to stand up.
Hmm.
And that's really the bottom line, because if you don't show up, then and the other side shows up, then the other side wins,
Yeah.
and on
Hmm.
anything, and especially in politics. So as we say, as we began this interview, we are the people who like to show up,
Hmm.
and we haven't had much chance during this interview to go into like the rights, why
Hmm.
we support the UK and so on. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we did put some ideas together in our book,
Hmm.
One Big Country, a big
Hmm.
book for the Union, Volume One. And that's simply available on Amazon by going to amazon.co.uk and searching for One Big Country. But
Is
in
that
that
on your
book,
website? Is it
it's only available through Amazon,
through Amazon?
but our website is
Hmm.
aforceforgood.uk,
Hmm.
and there's a shop in there that'll also, it's got a link to
Hmm.
Amazon and so on. But that's volume one of a projected 5 volume series,
Okay.
and
Hmm.
volume two will be out at the end of the year. And in volume
Hmm.
two, we're going to be looking specifically at the concept of Britishness, what it
Hmm.
is, how it came about, and how it can be maintained. This one, a big book for the country, one big country, is really just kind of laying out the principles of
Hmm.
unionism, and the next four
Hmm.
volumes will expand upon certain particular areas of unionism, including identity, which
Hmm.
is a big issue, a big political issue. And identity is the heart of politics, really, in many
Hmm.
ways. It's certainly the heart of the issues that we face here in Scotland.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think I would have probably the cut off the interview here because I've got another show called Flop Media where we do basically a culture talking podcast as well. And I'm actually very thankful for you, Alistair, to actually come on the show and actually be, I think, fourth or fifth guest. No, third guest, sorry. And I hope we actually get to do this interview in person because that's usually where we can get into the meat and bones of every single person's conversation. And I hope this podcast gets even more attention from you guys or any of the supporters that I have, and we can all start having that open dialogue communication between each other because the world's going to get a lot more messier after Thursday for us anyway. I mean, I,
That's
I
that's a
mean,
good
it's
way of
like
putting it.
how bad can it get? Really bad. Yeah, okay. Yeah, but
Yeah, yeah. Well, we live in exciting times,
mm,
and thanks for having us on. You do great work, and yes, we certainly will
mm,
promote the video when it's out there on
mm,
YouTube. We'll promote it across our platforms of Facebook, Instagram,
mm,
Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. And
mm,
our YouTube is youtube.com/UK A Force for Good. And that handle, UK A Force for Good, is the handle
mm,
on all our social media channels. And we
yeah.
publish every
Mm,
day on all
mm,
the platforms.
mm. Because I have to say, you guys are fantastic in trying to keep up the actual information that's going on against the, say, the independence people or the SNP. Because you are the guys that everyone notices for are the ones who actually count how much people go to these protests.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and it's just like the fact that you all just sit there watching them, seeing how much it is. But then I realized between these last two protests they actually lost 920 odd people from their prior protest in May to June. So I'm like, the momentum's gone. Or they're
Yes, it
just,
has
oh,
gone
yeah, it's
interestingly.
gone.
Mhm.
And it's
Mhm. It's
like, they would like to say, oh, they've went to the Euros, but you don't care that much about it, but 900 of you have all gone. It's like,
They didn't go to the Euros. They just couldn't be bothered showing up. But we
yeah,
showed up with our video camera.
Yeah.
and we've got it, and we do expose them because I think you're talking about the
Hmm.
one in Stirling where they had 290 people
Hmm.
on it, but they claimed on their social media that there was 1,500 on it.
Oh, fuck off, did
However,
they?
all they need to do is
Oh
watch our
man.
all they need to
Sorry.
do is watch
Yeah.
our 3.5 minute
Hmm.
video, and you can see that's not 1,500 people passing in 3.5 minutes. In fact, you can count them. It's a very leisurely count, a very
Yeah.
leisurely
Hmm.
stroll they were having as
Hmm.
well. Them
Hmm.
and their proverbial dogs on leash.
Oh well, four legs, that's two people plus.
Yes, yes, maybe they're counting them.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, like. But I would like to say thank you to Alister for coming on the show and promoting the Force for Good on Here Goes the New World Order, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.